Get started here this morning, as you can probably tell by the screen. Going to be in Ecclesiastes, going back to the Old Testament. Just thought this is a book that has so much to it, layers to it, if you will, part of the Old Testament wisdom literature. So I thought it'd be a good one for us to go through in more of a high-level survey or overview, if you will, as opposed to picking a single passage to dig into. But when you think about this book, what are certain phrases or sentiments that you might think of that come from this book? Vanity.
A time for order, a time for peace.
Yep. Any others?
Nothing new under the sun.
Under the sun, common phrase. Yeah.
There's a season.
Yep.
In the end, it comes to this. Eat, drink, be merry, enjoy the fruits of your labors, as God has provided.
Meaningless, or vanity, depending on your translation.
Utility.
Everything is meaningless. This is typically one of the first things you think of, just like it was here. When you think of these books, very typical sentiments that stand out to us. But if everything under the sun is truly meaningless, then why write? What would be the value of his words?
Beyond what's under the sun.
Exactly. So Ecclesiastes chronicles this quest for his search for ultimate meaning. And so while there are elements of despair and frustration in this quest, we'll see that it's actually a book of great joy and celebration. As we said, along with Proverbs, makes up the Old Testament wisdom literature. It deals with life, how it works, and principles for navigating it. Most believe it was written by Solomon, but there is some debate whether it was actually written by him or maybe in honor of him or in his tradition of wisdom. The first verse opens up and says, "The teacher, son of David, king in Jerusalem." And a few verses later it says, "I, the teacher, was king over Israel in Jerusalem." Well, there was only one son of David who was king and who reigned over Israel from Jerusalem, and that was Solomon. Because the other sons down the generation who were kings, it was in a divided kingdom, and the king of Israel reigned mostly from Samaria, whereas the king of Judah reigned from Jerusalem. So most pinpoint to Solomon here. But whoever the author, he takes an honest look at topics such as wealth, pleasure, wisdom, others, labor, as we've been talking about. But he understands to truly grasp, to understand, to experience each of these in their fullness. But in each of these, he finds that in and of themselves, they don't bring satisfaction. They don't bring ultimate fulfillment, ultimate meaning. They might be a means, but they're not an ends, if you will. And he grapples also with the inevitability of death for all of us. And so while at first blush we're tempted to see lament and despair, Ecclesiastes also brings this theme of joy. 7 times he implores readers toward joy. He says in verse 224, he says, "A person can do nothing better than to eat, drink, and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God." And then he says in verse 8:15, he says, "So I commend the enjoyment of life, because there is nothing better for a person under the sun than to eat and drink and be glad. Then joy will accompany them in their toil all the days of life that God has given them under the sun." And so there's a time of joy to be found in each of these things, in pleasure, in labor, in wisdom, but while recognizing their limitations, recognizing that they all can be very good things used for good purposes, but there are limits in what they bring as far as ultimate meaning and satisfaction. But to understand those limitations also allows us to come to God in all of how he has created us. We were created to seek God and find our ultimate fulfillment in him. And so he comes to the conclusion that we'll make our way to. After looking at the fullness of the matter, he says, "Fear God and obey his commands," and is the only way to live wisely in an uncertain world. And so as we'll get into this, we'll also be starting, I think we finished Ecclesiastes this past week in the one-year Bible. This coming week, we'll be starting the book of Galatians, and I read a couple of weeks ahead just to be able to prepare lessons. And reading through Ecclesiastes, what's that?
Show off.
Yeah. Reading through Ecclesiastes, I couldn't help but think of Galatians 3:3. It says, "Are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish by means of the flesh?" And I see the same contrast in the book of Ecclesiastes. This internal battle that we're all too familiar with in our own daily lives as Christians who still wear this fleshly body and experience struggles. But the contrast helps us characterize this journey that Solomon embarks upon, searching for and acquiring all that the flesh has to offer, but finding that while the seekings are worthwhile, they don't provide ultimate fulfillment and ultimate meaning. They're not substitutes for God. And so we see this same contrast throughout the book: light versus dark, vanity versus meaning, under the sun versus heavenly spaces, flesh versus spirit, as we see here. So let's start where Solomon starts. Verse 2, meaningless, meaningless, says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. What a way to start and draw in your readers. Is Solomon the ultimate pessimist here? What do you think he's feeling when he opens up this way?
Absent God is his point. He doesn't say, but that's the intent here. The whole book is about these things in and of themselves. Again, absent God, they're meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
But he ends it by saying these same things as before God are gifts. We should enjoy them. But he's making the case that how, again, just from a man-centered perspective, life is futile, vain, empty.
And we grow into that context throughout the book, right? But in verse 2, this is, we could say, absent God. This is man searching and feeling. Somebody was getting ready to say something. Maybe not.
I just said, that's what I was thinking when you said empty and unsatisfied.
Yeah.
We're so sensual driven, like what we can see, what we can touch, like that becomes reality for us, and we don't understand. We lose perspective. We don't like, we forget or we fail to understand that at any moment this thing is gone.
Mm-hmm.
And, riches or relationships or a job or
Mm-hmm.
life itself. But and I'm guilty of this all the time. It's like, that's the ultimate reality, what I can see, when it's all vanity in the end. I mean, it will all pass away. Old things will all pass away.
And we somewhat, even though we know the ultimate truth, we still somewhat have that struggle in our mind, don't we? Instantaneously back and forth between the two, and we experience that frustration. And that's really what, oh, go ahead.
I think of times when I get angry, and I've experienced some anger this summer. Inevitably, when I stop and I reflect on it and pray about it, it's always this issue. It's like I'm so consumed with something that doesn't matter, and I lose perspective and focus, and
Yeah.
I'm terrible at that.
Yeah. You're not alone. The word used here is Hebel, again, not a Hebrew scholar, so, but it's a word used 38 times throughout the book. So it is certainly a theme of the book, one that behooves us to understand and to grasp, to be able to grasp the book of Ecclesiastes, to understand Solomon's meaning here. And as with so many Hebrew words, there's no one English word that allows a one-to-one translation that accurately captures all that it means. And so you see a few things here from Strong's dictionary. It says, the sense of an idol and a fashioned object with a focus on its lack of value. meaningless, emptiness, futility, something lacking content or breath, vapor, something that is breathed through the nostrils and out with a focus on its brevity and lack of content. And so we see here elements of frustration. Solomon says, what does a man gain by all of his toil that he toils under the sun? We see perplexity. No one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. And fleeting. Youth is fleeting, he says, here today and gone tomorrow. So we understand these sentiments. He's vexed by his inability to understand life's enigmas, those things that are difficult to understand. And we can certainly relate to that. He's also perplexed by life's trials and brevity. And so he says in verses 14 and 15, I have seen all things that are done under the sun. All of them are meaningless, a chasing after the wind. What is crooked cannot be straightened, and what is lacking cannot be counted. So he looks around at the world around him and sees brokenness, corruption, sin, things we can't control, the crooked nature of society around us that cannot be straightened. And he's frustrated, he's perplexed by these things. There's a restlessness in his spirit, if you will, on behalf of Solomon. And so on one hand, he doesn't want to descend into pessimism, but on the other hand, he knows that faith is not going to cancel out the realities of life under the sun. And so he wants to guard both against pessimism, but also unrealistic optimism, if you will. And so he acknowledges that, as chapter 3, verse 11, it says, God has set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. What he knows there's more. He knows there's something worth seeking. What does it mean that God has set eternity in the human heart?
We all look for the transcendent, right? I think we're all, just the fact that we all know that we're all dissatisfied apart from God. I think that's, eternity is more than just time. It's like the infinite, the transcendent.
I immediately go to the word set. Like we were created for eternity. It's like, I've heard that cliche, and I don't want to get into the theological implications of all of it, but Jesus really was the only fully human who came to die. We were all created for eternity. He set it in our hearts for us to be eternal.
In a sense, he set this restlessness in our hearts meant to be guided toward a seeking after him, right? And so these things that we put to use toward worldly pursuits, we're still demonstrating the innate qualities placed in us by our Creator. Our creativity, our initiative, our work ethic, our striving to be better, while sometimes misguided, still is a reflection of what our Creator has placed in us. These are all good things. But
I think of what Paul writes in Romans chapter 1. I always go back to Romans chapter 1. The problem is not in the searching. The problem is what we end up settling for. Yep. We were created to search.
Yep. What are the things we typically search for? What's the world's view of success?
Well, I don't know. Something tells me it hinges on what happens here in November. That's what I'm hearing.
Yeah.
So.
But wealth, knowledge, power, pleasure. We have a very hedonistic society. These are the things that are thought to give life meaning. But what good are all these things if the go-getters and the slothful both go to the grave the same? This is part of the discussion that Solomon has as he's almost reads like a journal in his thoughts here. But Solomon knows there's something more, and he's going to apply himself to knowing it as an alternative to pessimism or resignation from society. He's going to pursue wealth, wisdom, pleasure, and more to see what they hold. The very act of him embarking upon this journey demonstrates that he doesn't truly believe that everything is meaningless. As we would interpret the word. He's determined to find where that meaning lies. And so if we look at verse 2, or chapter 2, verses 4 through 9, he starts with earthly pursuits and pleasures. It says, I undertook great projects. I built houses for myself and planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs of water, groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem before me. I amassed silver and gold for myself and treasure of kings and provinces. I acquired male and female singers and a harem as well, the delights of a man's heart. I became greater by far than anyone in Jerusalem before me. In all this, my wisdom stayed with me. Who wouldn't love to be able to say some of these things here? These are the things that we puff up our chest, find pride, and say, look what I have created. But it plays to our ego, right? It plays to our materialistic society. These are human achievements, amassing a name for ourselves. We all have probably chased after these things ourselves at one time or another, but we certainly see it all around us. But just a couple of verses later, he says, yet when I surveyed all that my hands had done and what I had toiled to achieve, everything was meaningless, a chasing after the wind. Nothing was gained under the sun. Why would he say that nothing is gained? Isn't this somewhat the entirety of human existence, certainly in American culture, to amass and build, and it's the rat race.
I think that, Keaton, I take it with you, but anyone I've talked to in depth about like achievements, when the achievement is over, there's always this sense of like either like just kind of it's over. Like it was almost the striving that was the purpose and motivation. I had a friend who did like a full Ironman years ago. He told me he trained for this for a year, and he was so excited about envisioning what he would feel like after it was over. And when he crossed the finish line and he kind of settled down, he said, "That's it.
That's it."
That was the accomplishment was that." And he said there was almost this sense of loss, like, okay, well, what's next?
Mm-hmm.
And I think you see this in people that, specific in American culture, they build their business and they sell it off and they make all this money, and it's like all this, the restlessness comes back. It's like the purpose. There's always a desire for more, and I think that's this longing that we're never satisfied. And so, really, what was gained if you aren't, like, the goal is to be satisfied. That's what we're trying to accomplish. And if what we do does not satisfy us, nothing was gained.
So that we need the next dopamine hit.
And none of those things are bad
Nope.
in and of themselves. It's just a slight carburetor adjustment. It's a perspective. These things done unto the Lord and recognized, and the ability to build a business, to achieve athletic excellence, and so many other artistry, music. These are gifts.
Mm-hmm.
Recognized, it changes everything. I go back to the previous passage where you were discussing, he sets eternity. And Augustine, we're reading Confessions, he says our hearts are restless. You have made our hearts for yourself, and we don't find rest until we find it in you.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a matter of perspective.
Calvin said our hearts are idol factories.
Yeah.
Well, and the danger that we so frequently fall into is being satisfied.
Yeah.
Like, how easy is it to get satisfied? I got my house, I got a full belly and that kind of thing. I'll go back to the sports thing. Like, how difficult is it for a team? It's imperfect, but it's a team, they win the Super Bowl. How difficult it is to come back with that same sense of purpose to do it again, which is why it's so unusual. Because you just we got there and it's over, and
Mm-hmm.
we can relax now. We're satisfied.
It makes me think of C.S. Lewis saying we're so easily pleased with, what we have, like the ignorant child who played with the mud pies when he ignored an offer for a holiday at the shore.
Yeah.
We're so easily pleased with what we achieve and not what God has for us.
Yeah. Well, notice what he says just a few verses later. It says, a person can do nothing better than to eat or drink and find satisfaction in their own toil. This too I see is from the hand of God, for without him, who can eat or drink or find enjoyment? First he said, all is toil, nothing was gained, it's all meaningless. Now he's saying a person can do nothing better than that. Eat and drink and enjoy his own toil. How can both be true? That's what we've been speaking about. You may recall we've used the word kavanah in the past, the intent of the heart. Are we doing these things purely to build materialistic success for ourselves? If so, we're chasing after the wind. We're not going to find that fulfillment. We'll find that our priorities are messed up. We're approaching it from the flesh of Galatians 3, if you will. Or are we honoring our Creator with the qualities that he has put into us? Solomon realized that there is gain in our toil. These are not bad things. They're just not the ultimate goal. There are limitations. They won't bring that fulfillment. They won't provide purpose. But if and when toil brings gain, recognize that it's from the hand of God. Closely related to that, to earthly pursuits, he next addresses wealth. He says, whoever loves money never has enough. Whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income. This too is meaningless. And again, recall the meaning of our word here. He's speaking of the fleeting nature, the temporal nature of wealth. Says it leads to satisfaction. If any of you recall, the great philosopher of the 90s, referred to as the notorious B.I.G., he says, mo money, mo problems. It's the pandemic of consumerism in our culture, isn't it? How has social media impacted our pursuit of wealth?
Everybody wants, well, it's what the preacher's gonna preach about today. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's stuff. Everybody wants what they have on social media, the other person.
I'd venture a guess that if Solomon were in this quest today, he might be writing about chasing after likes and subscribes and, shares to find that it's all ultimately meaningless. Nothing wrong with it in and of itself. But how do we cultivate contentment in the midst of this culture around us, social media in this instance? As Rob said earlier, contentment by itself can also lead to temptations of slothfulness. And so that's why Paul says, or 1 Timothy says, it's godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world and we can take nothing out of it, as Dana said earlier. But he continues in verse 19 and 20, he says, when God gives someone wealth and possessions and the ability to enjoy them, to accept their lot and be happy in their toil, this is a gift of God. They seldom reflect on the days of their life because God keeps them occupied with gladness of heart. Notice what the verse says. He doesn't simply say that wealth and possessions are a gift of God. We know they can be because every good and perfect gift is from above. But what does he say? The ability to enjoy them are from God. What does that mean? Wouldn't anybody enjoy them?
You seek more, you covet it, you're proud of what you've done. But the ability to enjoy them is, again, that what we keep talking about is that perspective.
There's always a bigger yacht.
As unto God.
Yeah. The ability to enjoy with godliness and contentment wealth and possessions is a gift from God for them, because we know, as we've talked about, they can certainly lead into the temptation of more and more and more, bigger and bigger, leading to the continual search for the fleeting. And so this ability to have contentment and not this ever seeking for more mentality. And so again, we see Solomon comes to the conclusion that wealth and possessions in and of themselves are not bad. They can be used for great good, but there are limitations. They're not going to bring contentment, fulfillment, purpose. But it is possible to have contentment, fulfillment, and purpose, whether or not one has wealth. In wealth or poverty, these are found in God, not in these things. They're not determined by your spirituality either, contrary to certain prosperity gospel. They neither inhibit the spirituality of a person.
I think just going in a different direction maybe, but like to accept their lot and be happy, it's like it can be equally ungodly or disobedience to not receive that gift.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, we can err in both ways, I think. And then be happy in their toil or their labor, that even the labor itself is a gift of God.
Absolutely. It's recognizing where our treasure is, right? Just as Jesus said, Matthew 13, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hidden in a field. When a man found it, he hid it again, and then in his joy went and sold all that he had and bought that field. It's recognition that our true wealth is not under the sun, as Solomon would say. That recognition allows us to have great possessions under the sun without them being a temptation or a pitfall. Our security is in Christ, not in that material wealth. And so while Solomon's journey may have begun with a pursuit of wealth in the flesh, if you will, at first, this is the Holy Spirit illuminated view that Solomon comes to. After applying himself toward toil, pleasures, wealth, possession, he next turns to human wisdom. He says, "Then I applied myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly. But I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. For with much wisdom comes much sorrow. The more knowledge, the more grief." What do you think he means here? With more wisdom comes more sorrow and grief.
I think the more that you understand, like, God gives us wisdom and discernment, and the more you learn about Christ, you learn how far you really still need to go.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not that we'll ever be perfect, obviously, until we get to heaven, but like, I know the more that I study, the closer I get to God, I'm like, man, my sins are way bigger than like, this is worse than I thought. I mean, because I think we have a tendency to kind of not think we look at other people and compare, and the standard is Christ. You know, we're to be made like Christ, not the person next door, the person on Instagram, or.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the more we learn about Christ, you see the vast ocean you still have to go, but it's sanctification. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it's kind of almost, it grieves you to see that, gosh, a lot of work still to do. And it's with him, obviously, but still.
It's what we see in the growth from youth to age. You know, when we're young, we think we know it all. And there's some things we know, and that gives us great power, and we think we know more than everybody else around us. But with age comes experience to know what we don't know. And so I was reminded of one of my favorite poems by Alexander Pope called A Little Learning. And I'll read it here. I know it can be a little difficult to grasp just hearing a poem like this, but try to grasp what this is saying. It says, "A little learning is a dangerous thing. Drink deep or taste not the Pierian spring. There shallow draughts intoxicate the brain, and drinking largely sobers us again. Fired at first sight with what the muse imparts, in fearless youth we tempt the heights of arts. While from the bounded level of our mind, short views we take, nor see the lengths behind. But, more advanced, behold with strange surprise, new distant scenes of endless science rise. So pleased at first, the towering Alps we try, mount over the vales and seem to tread the sky. The eternal snows appear already past, and the first clouds and mountains seem the last. But those attained, we tremble to survey the growing labors of the lengthened way. The increasing prospect tires our wondering eyes. hills peep over hills, and Alps on Alps arise. To me, this perfectly captures the same thing Solomon is seeing here, but also a sentiment that we learn as we gain experience and wisdom is the more we know we don't know. That's why a little learning is a dangerous thing.
Well, I mean, it's the source of what happened in the Garden of Eden. I mean, God created them to be with Him and content in Him, and they bought into the lie that there's more than. And yeah, as a teacher, I'm constantly trying to teach the kind of pursuit of knowledge or wisdom or that kind of thing. But I mean, we get caught up in that too.
This is the same man, though, who also said, we're to seek wisdom as silver.
Mm-hmm.
It's a precious thing. Again, I mean, it's a balancing act. It's really a kind of a tightrope he's walking.
It is.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what is truth? What is wisdom? And it takes us down that path.
And that's the same thing as, you know, we're staying high level kind of surveying the book, but that's what we're meant to see in each of these, that he begins a pursuit, you could say from a fleshly perspective, to see what this holds, and in each instance comes to the conclusion that while in and of themselves they are worthy pursuits, every one of them are worthy pursuits. There's nothing bad in and of themselves, but therein does not lie eternal purpose or fulfillment. And so it's perspective that is brought to each one of these.
You know, it's easy, and we understand it, but Hebrew mentality was, they didn't think in terms of fleshly versus body. Their whole existence was, you know, just hard.
Mm-hmm.
They lived by virtue of, you know, God's bounty. If they were blessed one year with rain and crops and harvest, so be it. But they knew great hardships, and he really justifiably said, you know, after these great pursuits, I mean, he lived a life of luxury, obviously. He had time to pursue these things. But it's easy to conclude, wow, what's all this mean? It's meaningless, it's futile.
Mm-hmm.
What's it done for me? Nothing. Until he adds before God.
Think of Solomon being the guy from Fiddler on the Roof. On the one hand, we have this, but on the other hand.
Can I say one other thing
Yeah.
about, because he says this same thing in Proverbs, with much wisdom comes some great pain.
Mm-hmm.
It's easier for me to understand that when I think of the reverse. You know, it's become a truism and a trite saying precisely because it is true. Ignorance is bliss.
Mm-hmm.
What's that mean? You don't know what you don't know. And the more you gain wisdom with insight, there's pain involved.
Mm-hmm. There's brokenness.
You have insights into other people, their feelings. You notice things. I mean, God gives that gift. That discernment is a gift.
Mm-hmm.
And with that comes, I mean, burdens and grievous pain.
Yep.
When you understand things.
The more Solomon pursued and gained wisdom, the more he learned that the ways of God were beyond reach as well. He says in chapter 8, verse 16 and 17, when I applied my mind to know wisdom and to observe the labor that is done on earth, people getting no sleep day or night, then I saw all that God has done. No one can comprehend what goes on under the sun. Despite all their efforts to search it out, no one can discover its meaning. Even if the wise claim they know, they cannot really comprehend it. So in a sense, you see Solomon arriving at the same conclusion that his father did in Psalm 8. What is man that you are mindful of him? As I begin to survey all the ways of God, what is man? Or of Paul in Romans when he says, oh, the depths and the riches and the wisdom and the knowledge of God, how unsearchable his judgments and his paths beyond tracing out. And so this quest for meaning, again, Solomon realizes the limitations of his quest. He could spend his entire life attaining knowledge, but never discovering the mysteries of God. And so this too was no substitute for seeking God himself. He recognized limitations, but also affirmed its importance. In chapter 2, he says, I saw that wisdom is better than folly. So it's not meaningless. There is a better way, if you will. So he says, I see that wisdom is better than folly, just as light is better than darkness. The wise have eyes in their heads, while the fools walk in darkness. We see this contrast of light and dark. God is the one who illuminates, if you will. Since while merely striving for knowledge can lead to perplexity, understanding that the fear of the Lord is that beginning of knowledge, gained through Holy Spirit's revelation in our day, will lead to contentment, knowing that God is in control. And so through these pursuits and others that Ecclesiastes covers that we haven't here this morning, Solomon begins to reflect on this journey and begins to impart advice, if you will, through this search. Initially, seeing this despair and frustration, we see that being overcome. He found out that life is not pointless, that there is merit in the search. There is a time for everything under the sun, but only God can offer anything that's lasting. And so in that, we find ultimate meaning, purpose, authentic joy. And so he encourages readers to find that joy. He says, however many years anyone may live, let them enjoy them all. Be happy while you are young, and let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Follow the ways of your heart and whatever your eyes see, but know that for all these things God will bring you into judgment. If you read the beginning of this, in your youth, follow the ways of your heart, whatever your eyes may see, pursue it, is the intent here. Is he recommending unrestrained worldly pleasures?
You're always learning.
Mm-hmm.
We learn from our mistakes as well as what I think the age of the initial age of exposure to pornography is now 5 years old.
Mm-hmm.
You know, once that happens, I don't know how you recover from that. You know.
Yeah.
But
I think it goes to what Heath is preaching on, boundaries of freedom.
Mm-hmm. Keep in mind, he's speaking here to the wise. This is not a recommendation for unrestrained worldly pleasures. He puts the boundaries on it in the next statement. He says, you have freedom, but know that for all these things, God will bring you into judgment. What is it? All things are, I forget all things are profitable, but not all things are efficacious or something. All things are possible. Yeah.
All things are lawful, not all things are profitable.
Yep. Similarly here, he says, go eat your food with gladness and drink your wine with a joyful heart, for God has already approved what you do. Anybody else find that an interesting statement? Go find joy because God has already approved what you do. Speaking again here to Christian liberty, freedom. This is similar to Jesus saying, it's not what goes in the body that defiles you, but what comes out of the body. For what proceeds out of the mouth comes from the heart. Book of Titus says, to the pure, all things are pure. Again, Solomon here is writing to the wise, those who understand that it is God who grants the blessing in our toil, in our search for wisdom, in our possessions, in our wealth, in everything. It's God who brings the ultimate meaning to those things. And so Solomon is able to find joy knowing that God has created everything under the sun. Eat, drink, be merry, find pleasure, but know for all these things God will bring you into judgment if you go beyond the boundaries that he has set.
You know, it's easy when you read this, you think, wow, how did he know what Jesus was going to say? The exact opposite.
Opposite.
Jesus was quoting and
Yep.
using what Solomon wrote, what David wrote, what the prophets wrote.
Yep.
I mean, I know it sounds silly, but I mean, it is really easy to get that confused.
Absolutely.
He also clearly says, I do not speak on my own, I speak only what the Father.
Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm paraphrasing here, but
No, absolutely.
there's an acknowledgement, I think, for God has already approved what you do. There's an acknowledgement that we do nothing outside of God's authority.
Yeah.
And He lets us. I mean, there's a pre-knowledge. However you want to get into predestination or whatever, but it's like God's in control. We say that all the time. Well, either we believe it or we don't. So.
We like to use the word sovereignty. We seldom think of what that actually means.
Yeah, I mean, I go and sin, like but I have to acknowledge, don't I, that God's in control, and He apparently allowed for that sin, approved even, maybe. And it's hard for me to grasp that completely.
Yeah.
Before you get too far removed from it, back to chapter 1, verse 17, and then the reason he could make this comparison that wisdom is better. We get stuck on the fact that he said, I pursued wisdom. He also pursued madness,
Folly.
Now, what did that mean practically? I have no answer.
Yeah.
But whatever it was, he concluded that wisdom was better. Than
Wisdom is better.
And I think in
He
the end,
sought all of those things.
Mm-hmm.
He's looking back on it.
Yeah.
At the time, he
Yeah.
perhaps thought it was wisdom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But only in hindsight do I realize that was
That may
madness
well
and
be
folly.
the key. He's saying, what was I doing?
Yeah, wisdom has to be discovered.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I'm convinced very few people intentionally do some of the things they do. It's only afterwards that, what was that?
Yeah.
I know we're getting off track here, but I go back to we have a group, we're reading Confessions, Augustine's Confessions on Thursday nights, discussing it. And the question and the theological and philosophical debate is the matter of the interior life. Augustine changed the way Western man thought because he cultivated the interior life. But Solomon, and I think this speaks to this argument, I forget what verse you had on the screen, but he said, they seldom reflect on the days of their life. So is that what he's talking about? That, their existence wasn't, they didn't think in terms of flesh and spirit. How could they? They didn't know. But they didn't reflect, or he said, seldom men reflect on the days of their life. And I think it has to do with what he's talking about. They're so burdened with the daily toil. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. If we come back here, he's speaking of the joy of one set free from the bondage of sin and guilt in Jesus, as we know today. But I mean, as we wrap up, Ecclesiastes really reads as a personal journal of Solomon's quest, his journey and search that he brings us into, in a sense. And so he discovers that he can stop striving against God's providence, because that is vanity. In a search for these things from a worldly perspective, you're striving against God's providence. Fulfillment and purpose are found not in, again, what we would call the flesh, but in a life guided by Holy Spirit, centered on God. And so when he comes to the end of his journal, reflecting back in his journey and his quest, he says, now that all has been heard, now that I've searched for all these things, I've come to conclusions, he says, and here it is. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the duty of all mankind. If possessions, pleasures, wealth, prosperity, and wisdom come, rejoice. Praise God, because the ability to have them and enjoy them comes from God. If hardship and toil, rejoice, because God is in the midst and will provide the strength to bring one through. that is the ultimate duty of man, to fear God, keep his commandments in whatever situation we find ourselves. And so, coming back to Galatians 3:3, are you so foolish? After beginning by means of the Spirit, are you now trying to finish the means in the flesh? In a sense, Ecclesiastes is the cliff notes on life. It provides the answers to a life of purpose and fulfillment. And so how foolish can we be holding those very answers in our hands while so often going back to pursuing pleasure, prosperity, wealth, and things in our own strength? It's the constant battle that we all experience this side of glory. And so hope we'll take this and find the ability to find joy in the reading of Ecclesiastes, but also the joy and contentment in our own journeys as we struggle through these things.